Welcome. So today we're going to continue with the third chapter of the Renaissance story. So we're going to make two more clips now for the last part. And we have the beginnings where he's in the square and warming up for the journey. The second chapter is when he goes to Florence and it's filled with the Renaissance. And now in the third chapter, we're going to go deeper into the ancient world. So here it starts. The second part of summer arrived, and I was still sitting in the little square, watching the familiar scene of people, a fountain, the mild sunshine softly over the cobblestones and the church tower. From my early age, the square had been a growing place of life, of learning, and for the love of living. The gratitude and friendships and the little moments of paradise with beauty and the mild glow inside for a fortunate life in peace and inspiration. It was a growing part of me, and for countless people over the centuries of history. I lifted the cup and thought back on the readings a few weeks earlier. I wanted to continue with the second and third book, how the pilgrim goes through the rinsing of sins on the Purgatory Mountain, and then through the spheres of heavens towards divinity and towards love. But I needed some more knowledge about the ancient times. There were too many references to Greek philosophers, to the history of the Church, to the Roman Empire and emperors, and to the moral structures and teachings of Aristotle. Dante contained it all, but sometimes more as a portal to the totality of the cultural history. And it was all shaped into a poetic journey of immense beauty. It was breathtaking. I slowly started to remember my earlier trips to the center of the Roman Empire and my wanderings in the streets of Rome as a younger man. It had been a foundational experience to sense the feeling from the ruins of the center of the civilized world at the time. The scale and ease of the imperial architecture was filled with wisdom and power. Even 2,000 years later, the effects on the senses were uplifting and inspired respect and admiration of the people who once built this, as a city-state and the empire they once ruled. This is really a feeling you get if you travel to Rome and some of the ancient parts of the old town around the Foro Romano. It's just the scale of it and the proportions are just, you get this sense that this was at the time all that kind of they had the whole world as they saw it, and this was the center of it. So the size of the columns were godlike, almost like the people 2 millennia before were more advanced and created a world of higher sophistication and structure than much of the later waves of cultures that had followed since. There was a clear sense of origins and beginnings, walking along the Colosseum and through the ruins of the Roman Forum and on the road of Via dei Fori Imperiali. The ruins, the trees in the horizon, and the light of the skies gave another feeling of timelessness, like one could see the surroundings through 2,000 years of time, in an instant. It was a transformative experience as a younger man, and I still wanted to go back one day, to see the same scenery with new eyes. One day. As I was sitting in the square, the mind continued to drift into the discoveries of philosophy at a younger age. But suddenly, these memories were re-examined from my current perspective and self, and I found them yet again full of new insight and relevance. So just make the point that there's a balance in the whole story to have the substance of the Renaissance and the ancient world, and then describe how this is changing the perspective and kind of in current time and kind of the nutrition it could be for you to just learn more and sense the world deeper and more nuanced and also more beautiful. One of my favorite paintings came to mind, from the Vatican and right before the room of the Sistine Chapel. There was the large wall with a fresco called the School of Athens. It was earth-shaking, both in its beauty, but also in its full depiction of the Greek philosophers, with the two giants of Aristotle and Plato in the center, one pointing up to the skies, another straight forward to the earthly. So this is just, from the Greek philosophy point of view, this is the main division of thinking in itself. If you want to think about practical things, and concrete, or do you want to think more imaginatively and an abstract world of ideas and more like an emotional, spiritual, what should we call it? Well, it's imaginative. Is the best word. And then how much of each, and especially Aristotle would say that you need both. And then, but this is the huge debate over thousands of years. And this is in the center of that painting, which is also the cover of the of this little story, like as a book. I had once sided with Aristotle as the pragmatic thinker, the one who described the world through empirical observation, but also described all the various forms of thinking, including the abstract and idealistic ones, which in his view was useful and necessary, but only partially so. There needs to be a balance. While I had considered the Plato school to be more concerned with the abstract world in itself. Revisiting these thoughts, I would reconfirm my preference for Aristotle. He was still the overall reaching philosopher, defining the world of thinking and its contents. And in the painting of the School of Athens, which was made by Raphael around 1500, there was the perfect blend of the artistic heights of the Renaissance and the contents of the ancient world. This is also why this painting is so iconic, because it takes all the beauty and the high Renaissance at the time with the painting as a craft and also just the aesthetics. And then it's filled with all the Greek philosophers and Alexander the Great and other historical figures. It was like two historical eras combined into one. And I stood in the room that first time and felt the history around me. The centuries of visitors and the knowledge emanating from the fresco and through time and the culture. There was so much to learn. I picked up a pen and my new notebook, full of interesting thoughts and ideas from the new studies I had done so far this summer. I had another sip of the espresso and wanted to look at the water streaming through the fountain for a few moments. The sight of flowing water had a calming effect on the brain. It was like a gentle massage or a way of opening the mind for new images, reflections, or meditations on the past and the present. I made a few notes about Rome and the Greeks, and a little drawing of the painting of Raffaello. And then I closed the book again, looked up at the sun, and rested my shoulders. It was one of the best summers in a long time, and I felt like I was seeing and thinking in new ways that made the world even more interesting than before. And then it was time to begin the rest of the day under the clear blue skies. So in this chapter, it's more of in the second chapter, he's traveling physically to Florence to see the environment, the surroundings of Dante and the artists and thinkers at the time. Rome and the ancient world is more in his mind, so he's thinking back on earlier experience and travels, just to showing two different ways of presenting the substance of it. As the week passed, I spent most mornings in the square, climbing my way through the Purgatory Mountain of Dante and enjoying the atmosphere of warm summer days. As I spent more time in the ancient world and the classical culture, another trip came to mind from the Greek temples in Paestum, in the southern part of Italy, what was once in the Magna Grecia or the Great Greece. When I arrived there late in the evening, I had discovered the fully intact temples in the darkness, under a star-filled sky. And I imagined that this was the exact same sight that had been before the eyes of an Aristotle, Epicurus, or Pericles. Like looking through 2,500-year-old eyes. It was chilling. And another little experience from my younger years that had created a connection to the deeper history of my country and of my continent. This meaning like in the Italian perspective. But this is also actually a true story. Traveling down to Paestum, which is around Naples. And if you come there at night and you can see the temples and you see the sky, like the stars, and it's just this enormous time span. And there's a clarity because there's no, It's not a city. It's just like tiny. There are some temples and some streets with a few houses. It's not even a village, but there's no background light from the from the ground, so you see the stars so clearly, which makes it even more kind of ancient and clear. So, but then one morning, as I had just gotten a coffee and was looking out at the square, I started doubting myself and the studies and the relevance for today. Was it just a nice fairy tale of romantic historical times, or interesting thoughts in an abstract play world? I wondered. I had created these imaginary stories and worlds in my mind and loved spending time in them, elaborating and looking at the little details, but suddenly it seemed remote and detached from the present moment as I was sitting by the table in the sunshine. I started to investigate my own motivations and the process of learning, what it did to the mind, and whether things were connected to practical everyday considerations, or if some or many things were more like hobbies for the brain, like playing a board game or training acrobatics for the thoughts. Immediately the answers started coming by themselves. How training the brain in itself was useful for all sorts of brain activity, and how I was using the thinking of Aristotle rather than Plato consistently throughout the day. Evaluating options for my life, interpreting people around me, exploring new neighborhoods of a city, finding alternatives for managing personal relationships, creating new opportunities in life, and building the bigger and deeper foundation for my life and the nature of my own thinking. I wanted it to be practical, pragmatic, connected to real experience, and seeking the best possible rather than the perfect. I tried to avoid abstract models for perfection as guiding principles, as they were often by nature a fantasy that could be disconnected and too far removed from the real world. So there was a direct effect from discovering Aristotle to how I would see, perceive, interpret, evaluate, and experience the world. This gave me a feeling of firm footing in one little step. And this was also perhaps the most fundamental one, to gain an insight and awareness of the nature of my own thinking, from which the other thoughts would grow and emerge in all other areas of life. This was important, I thought. The brain as a plant, an organic organism, and how to compose your thinking of the right balance of different elements. It would take many years to reach that point. But I now felt a new clarity and recognition of how this process had taken place over the years and the fruits of these efforts. Perhaps this was a sign that the major process had completed, that I could now sit in the little square, looking at the fountain, and fully reflect on this from the outside. The experience of this was new and almost euphoric. I lifted the cup and smiled a little. This was a surprising discovery, not planned for. And then the brain kept working on the other questions. So this is part about learning, and this applies to so many different things, that while you're in the process, it's kind of all around you, and it's hard, like not disorienting, but it's hard to know where you are in the process. But then in a snap, sometimes you just feel that you can see it from a distance. So some of it might be this, like how the brain fills up with things, and then it kind of digests it and moves it into the more intuitive parts of the brain. Often this goes with language, for example, that it goes in the logical part and then it moves over to the intuitive part. And while it's moving, it could sometimes be like not accessible also. So just wanted to make the point that if someone goes on this journey, like you want to really study the history or dig down deeper in the thinking, there will be points where suddenly it can be confusing, because or you suddenly see it with clarity, and that's just a normal part of the process. So that's and also this thing with, like, there's a doubt, and then instantly comes this flood of of a realization, like how this is useful and how this has already helped the person. And this is also like those moments of doubts could be the threshold to actually step in, like when it's when it has become digested, and then you can see it with new eyes, and then suddenly you look around yourself like this person is doing in the square all the time, and gradually or suddenly sometimes he sees the world with a different view, or with a different self, because if he sees it differently, perceives it differently, it's because something has changed in the person. Okay, so we're going to stop this this video here. So this was the first half of the last chapter, and then we're going to continue with the next video in a few moments. So thanks for watching, and have a great day.